Our speaker this evening is KVK Murthy. If I'm rather soft, please let me know. I tend to be rather soft. Our speaker this evening is KVK Murthy, a person of varied interests who has always marched to his own tune. KVK joined the bank in 1973. Not finding banking particularly inspiring, he found satisfaction in pursuing reading and writing. He made it to the semi-finals of the BBC Mastermind Quiz in 1999. His poems were published in The Guardian UK. His poetry has been included in the Bloodline Anthology of Contemporary Indian Poetry, edited by the well-known poet and novelist Jeet Tai. His first collection of poetry is scheduled to be published later this year. KVK has varied interests, to say the least, ranging from Central Asia to colonial history and military history, travel and exploration, as well as India's frontier history and border problems, an offshoot of his Central Asia studies. He, however, retains an interest in his original academic discipline of pure mathematics, physics, astronomy. He also considers himself a kind of specialist in UFOs, aliens, and ancient civilization narratives. Right, today he will take us on a journey in an area less traveled, Central Asia. It must be emphasized here that this area is not easy to traverse, the terrain being stark and mountainous and the temperature bitterly cold. Central Asia, especially Afghanistan and Xinjiang, has been and will remain crucial to India's interests, as it was earlier to Britain and Russia. KVK will elaborate the pivotal role of Central Asia in the Great Game and also take us along on his journey on the Silk Route. KVK?
Thank you, Vimla. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Before I elaborate or go into details, I'll read a 2 or 3 minute extract of an essay which I wrote last year for my Facebook page. I think this sort of more or less makes an abstract of the entire Great Game and puts it more or less into perspective. I think people will get an idea of what I'm talking about later. So I'll carry on with this reading first. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 brought to an end that long period of shadow boxing, which was glorified and romanticized by the British as the Great Game. Kipling immortalized it in his novel Kim. The Russians, more accurately and picturesquely, referred to the contest as a tournament of shadows. The game only officially ended in 1907 because its echoes continued to ring long after in one form or another. Those echoes will be heard in the First World War in Persia and in the Caucasus. They were heard in the Bolshevik interventions in northern Afghanistan and Badakhshan in the 1930s, and they would be heard in Xinjiang in China till the communist takeover in 1949. The convention merely drew fences, and like all colonial endeavor, the fences were either in or around someone else's property. In this case, Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. During the game's currency, close on a century, a large cast of characters strutted, stalked, or skulked about the mountains and deserts of Central Asia in a pantomime of spy versus spy. The basic premise was the protection of India from Russian conquest. Since Russia had swiftly swallowed the Central Asian Khanates, and since Persia and Afghanistan were both vulnerable, it seemed logical, to British eyes at least, that she wouldn't stop at the Hindu Kush. But she did just that, wide the Pamir boundary settlement of 1895. And not at the Hindu Kush either, but beyond, on the other side of the Oxus, present-day Tajikistan, which defined the boundary between the two empires. Effectively, with Afghanistan secured as a buffer, the game may be said to have ended. The rest was line. The Sindh campaign, the skirmishes with Persia, the Gilgit and Chitral affairs. Kipling, the laureate of empire, invested the game with an almost Eastern mystique. In this, he was as much an Orientalist as anyone else, and just as off the mark. At the end of his novel, Kim says, when everyone is dead, the great game is finished, not before. All right, with that little introduction, I'll get into this. I suppose and I presume that most people know what the great game was, at least in its broad particulars. Beginning with the early part of the 19th century,
Let's start
the early 1800s.
presentation.
Sorry?
Shall I start the presentation?
Sorry?
The
Should we start?
presentation, PowerPoint.
No, not yet. No, you can start the cartoon, maybe, yes.
Okay.
Well, starting with the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, things between, actually, the origins of the great game could logically be traced almost to Napoleon and Peter the Great, but we won't go that far. What happened was immediately after the first Russo-Turkish War and later the Crimean War, Russia lost a lot of territories and she lost a lot of rights, mainly her rights in the Black Sea. So to make up for this, and this was the 19th century, since it was the age of empire and empires were competing with each other for territory, for rights, for privileges, Russia naturally thought that the vast territory to her south, namely Central Asia, was waiting to be taken. This entire vast piece of real estate was actually parceled off into khanates, they were ruled by khans and emirs. The Khanate of Khiva, the Khanate of Bukhara, and the Khanate of Kokand. So in an effort to maintain what Russia considered her imperial balance, she swiftly managed to conquer all these territories south. She conquered Khiva, she conquered Bukhara, she conquered Kokand, and by the late 1800s, all of Central Asia was in Russian hands. And these were all military conquests. They were all led by Cossack generals and, the Russian cavalry. Now, this was a matter of grave concern for Britain because obviously any move southwards by Russia was perceived, both in Whitehall and in Calcutta, as a direct threat to India, because India was the jewel in the crown. So India had to be protected. Notwithstanding the fact that India had fabulous geographical, battlements, in terms of the Hindu Kush on the west and the Karakoram on the north and the Great Himalaya on the right, on the east. Notwithstanding that, the fact of Russia's swift advance into Central Asia was a matter of grave concern. So, so this was the prime impetus for what became known as the Great Game. Now, the Great Game was not a formal name. It was not a formal name. It was first used by Captain Arthur Connolly. It was a captain of Bengal Cavalry. He used it in a letter which he wrote to the Secretary of the Royal Geographical Society in London. And he was referring to spying against Russia, in the light of this advance. He was referring to spying against Russia, and he referred to the spying as a great game. He said it'd be a great game, it'd be a noble game. This business of spying against Russia, spying for Britain against Russia. In the 19th century itself, the great game was not a popular term. I mean, nobody used it. I mean, not too many people used it, or not too many people were aware of it, because it was just a casual reference in a letter by a young captain in the Bengal Cavalry to someone else. The term gained currency and its romance, mainly its romance, thanks to Kipling in the novel Kim. Now, Kim is the great game novel. It is the greatest great game novel, and it is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. It's a classic. It's an English literature classic. The romance of the great game, the so-called romance of the great game, all started with Kim. Why? Because this spying by Britain in Russia, or against Russia, was carried out in these inhospitable places, in these places beyond the mountains, beyond the Hindu Kush, beyond the Himalayas, beyond the Karakorams. The spying was done not by, traditional spies, whatever such a thing may be, but it was carried out by unorthodox people mainly army officers who were out on shooting leave. There was things called shooting leave. British army officers were given things called shooting leave. You could take shooting leave for 2 weeks, take your guns, go off into the mountains, shoot game, and at the same time do a bit of spying and come back, see what the Russians were up to. This was sport. But more than that, the actual romance of the great game vested with the natives. In this, the British played a master game. They trained the natives, they trained Indians to spy for them. And how did they do this? They took these youngsters, mainly people from Himachal Pradesh, today's Himachal Pradesh, and there was one particular family, actually, the Rawats, they're still there. These people, they were these youngsters, mainly in their teens, sometimes just in their early 20s, with a basic education, maybe, up to matriculation, and a good knowledge of mathematics, mainly trigonometry, and the ability to read English, the basic skills. These chaps were taken away to the Survey of India offices in Dehradun, and they were trained in surveying techniques. They were taught how to use a theodolite, they were taught how to use a sextant, they were taught how to use a plane table, they were taught how to take compass bearings, and so on. And these fellows, they were sent off. Now, why were these people sent off? Because it was very convenient. The British by themselves could not do much spying because these territories were closed territories. They were forbidden territories. Foreigners were not welcome. Any foreigner, the extent of xenophobia was almost extreme. Nobody was welcome in those places, especially a white man. And since most of these places were Islamic republics, non-Muslims were not welcome at all. In this, the natives had an advantage, which the British, absolutely capitalized to the hilt. They dressed these chaps up as pilgrims. These Indian natives, these Indians, they went dressed as pilgrims, in the guise of pilgrims, and they did their surveying, they took compass bearings, they made route marches, they made maps. They carried compasses and Tibetan prayer wheels. If you've seen a Tibetan monk, turning a prayer wheel, you know what a prayer wheel is. Now, instead of a roll of paper carrying prayers inside, what it had was a compass inside. So they took bearings that way. They carried beads, rosary beads, which had 100 beads instead of 108, and so on and so forth. So all this, the romance of the great game was, thanks to Kim, that book, that wonderful book. And because of that, a lot of people were inspired by it. A lot of people were, drawn to it. A lot of people went into the great game. And in Kim itself, this young boy, it's actually a coming of age novel. It's just a, street urchin, an Irish soldier's boy, a street urchin who goes native actually, because he's an orphan. He doesn't have his parents, but he's brought up in the street virtually. He knows the languages. He knows Hindi, he knows Hindustani, he knows Urdu, he knows all the languages. So it is this business of, going off and spying. And this thing of the great game is instilled in him from a very small age when he meets a Tibetan Lama and he meets this horse trader chap named Mehboob Ali. Then he meets a jeweler in Simla. And all of them are engaged in this business of the great game. And he's fascinated and enthralled. This inspiration is carried on not just through Kim, but through Kim to a whole lot of others who came after him, However, the great game by itself, because of all the spy versus spy nonsense which is going on, the British fought 2 wars in Afghanistan. And in 1885, at a place called Panjde, which is on the border between Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan-Afghan border, they almost came to blows in the sense that Britain and Russia almost came to war. But this, fortunately, things didn't didn't explode. Things were sorted out. And finally, the British and the Russians decided that enough was enough. We can't get into war. Therefore, let's draw, proper fences. So in 1895, they came to this Pamir boundary settlement, and they settled the Pamir boundary settlement. And according to the Pamir boundary settlement, there was a small little strip called the Wakhan corridor, the Wakhan strip, which is part of Afghanistan, which formed the buffer between the 2 empires, the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So with that, Afghanistan, after 2 wars, Afghanistan was firmly established as a buffer between the Russians and the British. And things were hotsy-totsy. And in 1907, they made this formal agreement called the Anglo-Russian Convention. Russia was virtually forced into doing this for 2 reasons. Because, first of all, they had had enough. And 1904 and 1905 was a very bad year. 2 years were very bad for Russia because, first of all, they lost the Russo-Japanese War to the Japanese. That was a disaster. And as a consequence of that disaster, they had the first revolution in 1905. Now, with these two major cataclysms in Russia, they thought that there was no point in carrying on further, conflicts elsewhere. So the Brits and the Russians sat down in St. Petersburg and came up with this Anglo-Russian Convention and said, all right, enough is enough, by which the Russians conceded that Afghanistan and Tibet were under the British sphere of influence, which is what the Brits wanted. India was safe, Afghanistan was a buffer, Tibet was a buffer, and everybody could go home. However, of course, that didn't happen that way because subsequently, as I said, the echoes of the great game carried on much later. Okay, that is my summary of the great game. I hope we'll carry on. My own interest in the great game came from many things. Of course, Kim was there, but it came fundamentally from one book which I read sometime in the 1970s, I think. It was actually Neville Maxwell's India's China War, which was, of course, about I think most of you have read it. That particular book, forgetting keeping aside the Chinese part of it for one moment, that book had one long essay, an introductory essay called The Limits of Empire. Now, it was this big essay, that's a 40-page essay, which kindled my own interest in the great game. That set the background for what was going on India's borders, why the China problem happened, and so on and so forth. But that was my kindling, for me, the kindling of my interest in the great game. And subsequently, in 1977, I read this book by John Kay called When Men and Mountains Meet, which turned me into, which completely changed my life. That was the beginning of what I call my Central Asia fever, because after that book, I collected every single book on Central Asia that I could find. And today, of course, I have I can modestly say that I have a fairly large Central Asia library. It's large enough to be called a library. So it is the travel literature which is associated with the great game, the travel literature associated with Central Asia. Because why Central Asia again? Not just the great game, because these places, the places that we are going to talk about, are also legendary places along the Silk Route. It just so happened that the Silk Route and the great game more or less coincided at most of the points of along most of its route, and most of the places where the game was played, most of the places where the Silk Route ran. So therefore, it was a congruence of interest in the great game, a congruence of interest as far as the ancient Silk Routes were concerned, and the travel literature associated with both these things. Great game, of course, the historical narratives, but also the travel narratives associated with the great game, the travelogues which came out right from the 19th century onwards, starting with Alexander Burns's famous Travels into Bukhara, which more or less set the template. And after that, all the travelogues which came. Bukhara Burns, he was known as Bukhara Burns. His book was in 3 volumes, and it was a bestseller published by John Murray, and it became a bestseller. I don't know how many copies it sold, but it became a bestseller. And it became a kind of a trigger for other people to write similar travelogues, and thereby setting what I call the British school of travel writing, the British, the genre of travel writing, which single-handed almost was invented by the British thanks to people who wrote travelogues like this. It's sort of spilled over well into the 20th century. We have fabulous travelogues in the 20th century in Central Asia, concerning Central Asia itself. So my interest in Central Asia is because of these travelogues, to this travel writing, which this huge, massive geography produced, thanks to the travelers who traveled through it. Why was it such a fascination? For one thing, because there is this business of Orientalism, which I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but the West always tended to view the East as something very mysterious, something very, they always add adjectives to the word East, the Orient, and all this, just mysterious East, the fabled Orient, the fabulous Orient, and so on and so forth. Now, this is what Edward Syed, Professor Edward Syed, Professor of Columbia University, who, in fact, made a very big scathing argument against this Orientalism in his famous book called Orientalism, which came out in 1978. So all this fascination with the East is nothing but a symptom of that, is in fact a manifestation of that Orientalism, this mysteriousness of the Orient, this fabulousness of the Orient. All this because of, the translations of the Arabian Nights, the translation of the Rubaiyat, and all those Oriental classics, the so-called Oriental classics. In the 19th century, to be an Orientalist was a compliment. In the 20th century, it is a term of abuse, because when you're called an Orientalist today, then you're being branded as a colonialist, as a reactionary, and all kinds of things. See, I mean, you have to read Edward Said's book rather, but I won't go into that. But it is an interesting sideline. This business of Central Asia, this fascination with Central Asia, is an Orientalist phenomenon. The irony is that for me and my friend who traveled with me, both of us are Central Asia buffs, the irony is that neither of us is a Westerner. We are not white. We are not white people. We are not Englishmen. We are not Europeans. So we have no excuse to take an Orientalist view of the East. However, since our own minds have been conditioned by narratives, by Western narratives, our own view of the Orient, of Central Asia, is essentially an Orientalist, you might say, an Orientalist view, an Orientalist lens through which we see all of this. So I'll give you a brief idea of, I mean, that cartoon, of course, is, I don't think it needs any explanation. Does anyone know what that means? What that shows? Well, actually, that's in the middle is Afghanistan, and on the left you have the Russian bear, and on the right you have the British lion. That's the great game in essence. So I'll give you Dasarathi has made a very nice collage of some of my travel literature. So maybe you can see the slides now, the travel collage. Dasarathi?
Yeah.
Yeah, the travel literature collage.
Yeah.
This is the map of Central Asia. That oval represents the playground of the great game. These are some of my books. Just I mean, whatever I could pick up and throw onto my bed, which Dasarathi. That oval out there. That is the virtually the playground of the great game. That was the vast area on which the great game was played. These are the countries which I visited. My friend and I visited, of course, not Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, but the stans. We visited Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Xinjiang. Xinjiang on the right in China. Yes, next slide. Next slide. This is the Silk Route. Actually, the Silk Route is not one single route, but it's a number of routes. I mean, branching off from one central point in China, in Western China, in Eastern China, called Xi'an, Xian. Xi'an. Xi'an is the beginning of the Silk Route, and it branches off. The end of the Silk Route was Damascus. Yeah, you start off at Xi'an in Eastern China, and it ends in Damascus in what is Syria. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, this is part of my travel. I mean, this is just a very small part of my travel. I would request you to pay special attention to the book on the extreme left bottom. It's a book called When Men and Mountains Meet, John Kay. I shall come back to this book on the last slide. Okay, now we begin the slideshow. This is Uzbekistan. No, next slide. Uzbekistan. Yeah, this is the country, the map of Uzbekistan.
There's a delay.
All right, this is in Samarkand. This was Timur Gulem's capital. And this is the mausoleum complex, Timur's mausoleum in Samarkand. It's called the Guri Amir. Gur is a Guri grave, as we know. And this is the mausoleum complex of Taimur in Samarkand. Next slide. Next slide. This is the actual gravestone of Taimur. That black slab there, that big black block. Actually, that big black block is the largest block of black jade in the world. It's the largest single block of black jade in the world. There's a small history there. In the 18th century, Nadir Shah, when he attacked Samarkand, he wanted to take that block away with him, that block of jade. But apparently, while carting it, the block cracked. And he immediately dropped it back because he thought it was the curse of Taimur. And that's why we get to see it. That crack, by the way, is still there. Next slide. This is the iconic image of Samarkand. This is called the Registan Square. This is actually a huge square. On the left is, there are three madrasas. On the left is the Ulugh Beg Madrasa. In the center is the Jilla Kori Madrasa. And on the right is the Shidar Madrasa. The Shidar Madrasa is actually very, it's got a certain uniqueness to it because Shidar means lion gate or tiger gate, Sherdar, Dar is gate. On the top panel, there are two panels right at the top of the gate which show the sun and two tigers, you know. And the sun has got an anthropomorphic face. It's got face, it's got eyes, and, you know, like you draw a typical sun with two eyes and a nose and, you know, rays and stuff. Now, that is an Islamic heresy because in Islam, all portraiture is forbidden. You can't show living things. So this is a kind of an anomaly in a predominantly Islamic country or an Islamic place like Samarkand. And when we asked the guide about it, how this was, he said it's a remnant from their Zoroastrian heritage. But the question remained, why Taimur allowed it to remain? Because he was known for his iconoclasm. But this is some kind of an oddity. But this is one of those classic shots in all of Central Asia. This is a Central Asia classic shot, the Registan Square in Samarkand. Next slide. Now, okay, this is in Bukhara. Now, these two chaps are very much part of the great game. On the left is Colonel Stoddart, and on the right is Arthur Connolly. Now, Arthur Connolly, remember, was the man who coined the phrase, the great game. Colonel Stoddart went to Bukhara on a great game mission. And the Emir of Bukhara, Emir Nasrullah, he promptly, locked him up in his, he dumped him in a pit called the Viper, the bug pit, the famous bug pit in Bukhara. He dumped him there. After a few months, he took him out and he told him he could, he would be free, provided he converted to Islam. Stoddart, duly converted, and he was a free man for a few days. Now, nothing was heard from him back in Calcutta or in Kabul at the time where the Afghans were, where the British Army was stationed just before the first Afghan war. So Arthur Connolly volunteered to go to Bukhara to find out what happened to Stoddart. So Connolly turned up in Bukhara, and when Connolly turned up in Bukhara, he too was put into the bug pit. And they were in the bug pit for something like 2 months, both of them. And this bug pit was infamous because the bug pit contained every known specimen of vermin. It had snakes, it had centipedes, it had scorpions, it had rats, mice, it had rodents and anything. In fact, it was hell. And they were there in that bug pit for 2 months. At the end of 2 months, both these chaps were taken out and they were beheaded in the square outside the Ark of Bukhara. Ark is the fortress. We'll come to this slide. And they were both beheaded. So when we went to Bukhara, our primary reason, it was a pilgrimage. We wanted to see this one, the bug pit. This is the famous bug pit where they were put for, when they were imprisoned for 2 months. Our guide didn't, in fact, he didn't think that anybody would know about this. We were the only two, my friend and I were the only two who asked about this vermin pit. And he said, my God, we didn't know that you knew about it. We said, yes, we know about it. We came to see this. So he said, all right, a special gift for my friends, for my Indian friends. And he took us here. He showed us this bug pit. This was where Stoddart and Connolly were imprisoned for 2 months and finally beheaded. For us, this was a pilgrimage. We actually went to see this. Next slide. Dashrathi. Next slide.
We are on this
Next slide.
Khoja Nasruddin.
Yeah. Yeah. This is Bukhara again. This is Mullah Nasruddin. He's the patron saint of Bukhara. And this is the Ark, the famous Ark of Bukhara. And Stoddart and Connolly were beheaded somewhere here in that space that you see right there. Next slide. Next slide. This is the entrance to the Ark, the famous Ark of Bukhara. This again is an iconic image. I mean, it's like, like we have whenever the West wants to depict India, they show the Taj Mahal. So likewise, this is Bukhara. And there's another one coming up, the tower, the famous Tower of Death. This is the Ark entrance, Bukhara. There's a silk factory in Bukhara. This is the city of Khiva. This again is a Silk Route oasis. Now, Khiva also has a place in great game literature, great game narratives, because Khiva had a huge slave market, also Bukhara, but both of these places had huge slave markets. In the Khiva slave market, there was something like 400 odd European slaves of all extractions, and they were not being released by the Khan. Finally, it was an a young English captain, Captain Richmond Shakespeare, who negotiated their release with the Khan, and he led all these 415 released slaves all the way from Khiva to a place called Orenburg in Russia. It was a march of something like 400 odd miles. And I mean, he was like a Pied Piper, leading all these children, these slaves. And for this act, he was knighted. He became Captain Richmond Shakespeare. Of course, the Russians did not appreciate this very much because it was still very, the great game was just hotting up. And the idea that it was an Englishman who had these slaves, among them, many of them Russians. And the Russians themselves had failed. Where the Englishmen had succeeded didn't go down very well with the Russians. Also, there was a famous Hungarian traveler, Arminius Vamberi, who traveled to Khiva in disguise. He almost was beheaded when his disguise was seen through. But finally, one of his traveling companions spoke up for him and he said, no, he's vouched for him, saying, no, he's a genuine pilgrim. He's a dervish. And therefore, I mean, he should be set free. And therefore, he managed to escape virtually by the skin of his teeth and managed to make his way to Samarkand and beyond to Tashkent. Next slide. This is the famous Kalon Minaret in Bukhara. And this tower is infamous because this was the tower from which the Emir, Nasrullah, used to throw his prisoners to their death. From there, they used to be carted up to the top of the tower and they thrown down. And incidentally, this was the only thing which Genghis Khan, when he invaded Central Asia, this was the only thing which Genghis Khan spared. The rest of Central Asia, all the cities were razed to the ground. But this one particular minaret seems to have defeated Genghis Khan. He took one look at it and said, I can't do anything to this. And he left it alone. Next slide. Okay, now we are at the eastern extremity, northeastern extremity of Uzbekistan. This is the fishing port of Moynak on the Aral Sea. Now, the Aral Sea, we went there because we wanted to see what was left of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea at one time, till at least about 60 or 70 years ago was a huge body of water with a very wonderful ecosystem sustaining a magnificent fishing industry and various allied industries and a wonderful thriving community. Unfortunately, because of Stalin's short-sighted policies, this entire Aral Sea became desert. I mean, the waters of the Aral Sea dried up because suddenly Stalin got into his mind that the whole of Central Asia must start cultivating cotton. So the rivers, the waters of the two rivers, the two main rivers, the Amudarya and the Sidarya, that is the Oxus and the Jakhates, these two rivers were diverted for cotton cultivation. Now, these two rivers were the main feeders of the Aral Sea. These two rivers were diverted for cultivation of cotton. Not only that, Stalin went so far, he actually built a canal called the Grand Fergana Canal, which is there in the Fergana Valley, the Grand Fergana Canal, where the entire waters of the Sir Darya were diverted, and the whole of Central Asia was given over to cotton cultivation and nothing but cotton cultivation. Even food crops were suppressed. There were no food crops. The orchards, the fruit crops were suppressed. It was only cotton, and nothing but cotton. So the Aral Sea dried up, and over the next 50 years or so, I mean, it was reduced to a ghost of itself. Now the Aral Sea is shared by two countries, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The northern part is in Kazakhstan, the southern part is in Uzbekistan. So we went to see what was left of it. This is incidentally the 20th century's largest man-made ecological disaster, the Aral Sea disaster. Now this is the famous ghost fishing fleet, you know, these ghost ships. There's nothing there. That used to be water at one time. All that desert out there used to be water. That was the Aral Sea. And these are fishing boats. They're just rotting, rusting hulks now. And the whole place has become toxic because of pesticides and fertilizers which were used. This is all that is left of the Aral Sea, just a small little sliver. Next slide. Okay, that ended Uzbekistan. Now we come to Kyrgyzstan. That's the map of Kyrgyzstan. It's bounded on the south by Tajikistan, and the north by Kazakhstan, and the left by Uzbekistan, and on the east by Xinjiang. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, next slide. That's the next slide.
So on the second slide, because there's some delay between.
I'm still on the Kyrgyzstan map now.
No, it is.
Oh, all right.
I have moved.
Yeah. Go back to the previous slide. Go back to the previous slide.
Yeah, I'll do that.
It's Nikolai on the slide.
Yeah. Okay, this is Nikolai Przewalski. He was one of Russia's greatest Central Asia explorers and one of the greatest Central Asia explorers in the world. In fact, in the history of Central Asian exploration, Nikolai Przewalski is a very, very big name. He's in fact considered the Russian Sven Hedin, because Sven Hedin is a famous Swedish Central Asian explorer, and Nikolai Przewalski is considered to be the Russian Sven Hedin. This is a Przewalski museum in a place called Karakol, which is the extreme eastern end of Isikkul Lake. So we went to, this was our pilgrimage in Kyrgyzstan. We went to see the Przewalski Museum at the eastern end of Isikkul Lake. Next slide. That's him. That's Nikolai Przewalski. He was an officer in the Russian Imperial Cavalry. And he died in Karakol, the place where the museum is, because he was about to set off on his 5th mission on his fifth expedition to Tibet, and he died of typhoid by drinking contaminated water. This is the interior of the Przewalski Museum. And here, I mean, it's all his expedition equipment, all his camping equipment, all his scientific instruments, the papers which he wrote, his journals, all of them are preserved in this museum. Yeah, next slide. This is Przewalski's grave. And this is, I think very few people, I don't know how many people in India have gone and seen this, but this is, for us, it was a very big feather in our own cap, because going and seeing Przewalski's grave is, I mean, this was the ultimate, because here we were looking at the resting place of one of the greatest names in Central Asian exploration. By the way, there's a breed of wild horse in Central Asia, and that horse is named after him. It's called the Przewalski horse. It's a breed of wild horse in Central Asia. That's Przewalski's grave. Next slide. That peak is called Przewalski Peak. This is from my hotel room in this town called Karakol, the extreme eastern end of Isikul Lake. This is in the Tian Shan Mountains. By the way, those mountains in the back, that's the Tian Shan range. Kyrgyzstan is bounded by the Tian Shan Mountains on the east. Now, this is the home. This is in Bishkek, which is the capital of Kyrgyzstan. This is the home and the museum named after him of the famous Soviet general in the early revolutionary years in the 1920s, Mikhail Frunze. Incidentally, the name of Bishkek was Frunze for a very long time. It was named after him. The capital was named after Frunze, and changed to Bishkek only after independence in 1991, after the Soviet Union broke up. Even today, the airline code for Bishkek is still FRU, Frunze. So now the reason I put the slide in, and the reason why this is important, is that is Mikhail Frunze's original home, and the entire museum, the Frunze Museum, is built around that home. So inside the home, you have everything preserved exactly as it was during the general's time, even his childhood crib, his little bed, his mother's bed, you know, the kitchen, the kettle, the tea samovar, I mean, all the rest of it. It's all preserved exactly as it was when the general was still alive. And this is his home. The entire museum is built around that home, which we thought was an excellent conservationist idea. I mean, you don't have to destroy something old to build something new. Next. This is one of those towers. It's called the Purana Tower. It goes back to the Karakhanid dynasty, the 11th and 12th centuries in Central Asia, particularly in this place called Balasagun in central Kyrgyzstan. The Purana Tower. Next slide. Now, this is the Isikul Lake. It's a huge lake in the middle of Kyrgyzstan. It's a massive lake. I mean, it's more like a sea. It's actually like a sea. It's a salt lake, it's a saline lake, and it's a warm water lake. It doesn't freeze over even in winter. I think it's second only to Lake Titicaca or something. This is a 14th century caravanserai called Tash Rabat in Kyrgyzstan. It's in the center of the Atbashi range in the Tian Shan mountain range. This is, although they say it's a 14th century caravanserai, people say that, in fact, historical records too say that it dates back much earlier, probably to as early as the 10th or the 9th century too. It's just a stone, resting place for caravans, although it looks more like a prison actually. We've been inside. Next slide. Right. Now, those little things, those huts are called yurts, Y-U-R-T-S. They're called, this is traditional dwelling abode all over Central Asia, all the way from Mongolia through Mongolia, all over Central Asia, you find these yurts. And these are typical dwelling places of nomads, of nomadic people. The Kyrgyz are, by the way, nomads. And the one in the center, that's where I spent the night at Tashrabat. This is on the, just outside Tashrabat, that caravanserai that I just showed you. So that center one was the one where I spent the night. Now, this is a very strange thing. Despite it's being almost Arctic outside, the cold is absolutely impossible. You have freezing winds, even in the season that we went. We went in October. It was freezing outside, but inside it's very warm because it's all felt. It's lined with felt and wool and sheepskin, all kinds of things. And in the center, there's a fire, which is fed by dung, yak dung, mainly yak dung and horse dung. You have this fueled with this, and there's a central flue, a kind of a chimney which comes right up at the top of the of that yurt, and that keeps the entire yurt warm. Next slide. This is just landscape on the way to the China border, the Xinjiang border. The mountain range at the back is the Transalai range. We are going to the Torugat Pass, which is the border crossing between Kyrgyzstan and China, Xinjiang. Next slide. And that is the Torugat border crossing. That is those gates that you see there, that is the border. And the other side is Xinjiang, China. We're waiting for our our travel agent to come from the other side and fetch us. We are still on the Kyrgyz side. Yeah. Next. Next slide. And this is the southern shore of Lake Isikul. Remember Isikul, we saw just a couple of slides back. That was the northern shore. This is the southern shore. We actually did a complete circuit of the lake. We did a complete circuit of the lake from, right round. It took us 8 hours one way. We spent one night at Karakol and saw the Przewalski Museum. And the next morning we drove on the southern side and came back to Bishkek. Next slide. Tajikistan. That's the country, the map. This is me and my friend in Dushanbe, which is the capital of Tajikistan. There's a public park there, and that is the bust of Tagore. So my friend said he had heard about it. Of course, he being a Bong, obviously he wanted to check out Tagore. So we went and, hunted out this statue, this bust of Tagore. Next. Now, we were traveling on the Pamir Highway. The Pamir Highway runs all the way from Dushanbe all the way to Osh in Kyrgyzstan. It runs right along the southern borders of Tajikistan on the river Oxus, which is the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Now, while driving on the Pamir Highway, we are actually looking at Afghanistan across the river. The river is the Oxus. So for 5 days that we drove on the Pamir Highway, we were actually looking at Afghanistan. This is the northern border of Afghanistan, by the way. These are all Afghan villages. Now, these are villages which I think the Taliban have taken over recently, and I think it's very much in the news and very, very contemporary now. So that's Afghanistan. Next. That is the river Oxus. Here it's called the Panj. They call it the Panj River. And further downstream as it goes along, it's called the Amodarya, which is the Turkic name for the Oxus. It's a historic river because it's the Great Oxus. It's the river which has been crossed by, you name it, everybody in history, starting with Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, all of them, this river is pregnant with history. So this is the famous Oxus. And on the left is Tajikistan, on the right is Afghanistan. Next. Next slide. This is a mosque which we happen to see on the Afghan side. Next. I mean, nothing remarkable about it, just an Afghan mosque. Next. Next slide. That's it. This is the city of Korog. It is the largest city in the Pamirs. It is in the central Pamirs. So Korog, now Korog is a very important place because it's got 2 universities. And it's also got the only Indian restaurant in Tajikistan, in the Pamirs. It's a restaurant called Delhi Darbar, where the food was excellent. And we had great fun. That's the only place probably in all of Central Asia where I had a proper Indian vegetarian meal. Korog. Next. And this is the Wakhan Valley. We're in the Wakhan Valley, actually. That fortress out there, it's the Yamchun Fortress. And this is a 3rd century BC fortress. And by the way, it's a Kushan fortress. It dates back to Kushan times. It's a 3rd century BC, that's right. 3rd century BC Kushan fortress. On the other side, of course, is Afghanistan. That is the Hindu Kush range, seen from the Pamir Highway. This is the Pamir Highway. The Soviets officially, the official Soviet name of this highway is the M41. This is the Pamir Highway. We're on our way to this place called Murgab. On the right is the Pamir River. This is the Alichur Pamir, a lunch stop there. Incidentally, the word Pamir, it means a high altitude grazing ground. So since all these were nomadic communities, particularly the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks, they used to come to these high altitude grazing grounds in summer and bring their flocks of yaks and sheep and goats and what have you, and then go back to lower altitudes in winter. So there's a place called the Alichur Pamir. Next. Now, this was a surprise. We were having coffee in this cafe in Murgab, place called Murgab, which is the easternmost city of Tajikistan. We were having coffee there, and when the lady, she put the coffee, the instant coffee tin right in front of us, we were surprised to see that the coffee was made in Coorg. It's from Kushalnagar. So we had actually a sort of an echo of home all the way in the Pamirs. This is actually coffee from Kushalnagar and Coorg. Next. Next. Rashtrapati,
Yeah,
this is the Karakul Lake in Tajikistan. Now, the thing about Central Asia is you have a lot of these Karakuls. They have Karakul in Tajikistan, they have a Karakol in Kyrgyzstan, and they have a Karakul Lake in Xinjiang too. Karakul means black lake. Kara means black, Kul is lake. Now, in Central Asia, a lot of words are prefixed with Kara, Ak, or Kizil. Kara means black, Ak means white, Kizil means red. You know, so it's Akkul, Akdis, Akbashi range, Karakul, Karatag. Karatag means black mountain. You know, think Kizil's like Kizilsum. Kizilsum means the red desert. Karakum means black desert, and so on and so forth. So you have this entire pan-Turkic linguistic distribution all over Central Asia. So I mean, they're not very imaginative. It's either black, red, or white. This is Karakul in Tajikistan. It's a huge lake, by the way. The Karakul Lake in Tajikistan is a massive lake. Again, a salt lake, a saline lake, but it doesn't support any life whatever. There are no fish there. There are no fishing communities. In fact, the people who live there, we even wonder how they live, what kind of existence they lead out there, because there's nothing. They don't grow anything out there. There are no fishing. There's nothing at all. Next. This is a Buddhist stupa on the Pamir Highway in a place called Vrang. Buddhist stupa. Next. This is Murgab, the easternmost city of Tajikistan. Now, Murgab has great game associations for us. It had great game associations for us because in the 19th century, Murgab was known as Pamirsky Post. It was an outpost of the Russian army. They had a post out here. It was called Pamirsky Post, and that became the city of Murgab. And I mean, that's how the Russians were keeping an eye on the British across the Afghan border, the other side, So we came, the next slide, you'll see what we think, logically sort of rationally concluded must have been the Russian outpost itself. This one. This is the police station in Murgab. And this is the oldest or one of the oldest structures in Murgab itself, dating back to more than 120 years. And the people told us that this was one of the oldest, and we thought that this must have been the original Russian Pamirsky post. This was the original Russian army outpost. Only on the basis of Lenin's statue out there, because obviously, I mean, if it's a government building, if it's for the government outpost, I mean, post-Soviet times, I mean, it only seemed natural that you erect a statue of Lenin in a government establishment. So that is Lenin in Murgab. Pamirsky Post. Next. That's our guide in the center, Afruddin.
KVK, we have only a few minutes more.
Yeah. You haven't done Xinjiang yet? Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
All right, let's rush
Move
now.
on to
Because I think there's been some slowness in the slides.
Yeah.
Next slide. All right, we'll rush through Xinjiang. That's Xinjiang right at the top there, yellow. There's the animal market in Kashgar. The Mustagata mountain, Karakul. I remember I mentioned Karakul. This is the Karakul in Xinjiang. But this is a freshwater lake, unlike the other one. This is a freshwater lake. It's a glacial lake. That's Mustagata mountain. The prettiest mountain in Central Asia. Next. This is Tashkurgan. This is the old stone fortress in Tashkurgan. Tashkurgan means stone fortress. And this is the old stone fortress in Tashkurgan in Xinjiang. Tashkurgan is on the Karakoram highway from which leads from Kashgar all the way to the Pakistan border in Gujarat. This is the Taklamakan Desert, Xinjiang. The Tarim River, the river of Xinjiang, the Tarim Bridge. Next. Next.
Chaikhana.
This is a Chaikhana in Kashgar. Chaikhana are the tea houses. And by the way, the chai they drink is green tea. It's not our tea. Next. Next slide.
Can you see the chini bag?
Not yet. I've got this Tashkurgan Eagle.
That's the earlier one.
No. Chini bag was not there.
Earlier slide.
No, it didn't come up.
Yeah, I did.
It's coming now. Chini bag comes after this eagle.
Oh, okay. All right, this is Chini Bagh. Now, this is the British consulate in the old British consulate in Kashgar. This was a great game listening post during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. This became the consulate of India and Pakistan after independence. And in 1949, of course, the Chinese threw us out. They told the Indian consul to leave. So he marched all across Central Asia. Literally, he and his family marched all across Central Asia. This is the Russian consulate. Now, this is the rival great game listening post, the Russian consulate in Kashgar. This is the Idgah Mosque, Kashgar, the largest mosque in Xinjiang. Next. Next.
Kashgar Old Town.
No, I'm not seeing the slides.
Yeah.
This is Kashgar Old Town.
It's taking longer.
This is on the Karakoram highway on the way to the Kunjarab Pass, which is the border, the China-Pakistan border, with the CPEC that they're talking about now. This is the CPEC, the famous CPEC. This is a mausoleum in Yarkand of the poetess, the Aman Nishan, Uyghur poetess, Yarkand. Next.
Old People's Park.
This is Old People's Park, Yarkand. Aksakal Park. Aksakal means the grey beards, white beards.
Old Yarkand.
This is Old Yarkand. This is a place called Kargil Lake. Now, this road is important because this is the famous, there's the start of the famous Xinjiang Tibet highway. This was the cause of all our troubles with the Chinese because this was the road, the beginning, this is the beginning of that road, which we discovered in 1957. An army patrol discovered this road in 1957 in the Aksai Chin Plateau. Remember in Ladakh, northern Ladakh, we discovered this Chinese road running through it. This is the beginning of that road in Kargil Lake. This goes all the way to Tibet, all the way to Lhasa. And this is that famous Xinjiang Tibet highway. The G219. This is the one which runs through Aksai Chin. And the map on top will show exactly where it runs. A small little portion on the right, on the top right. These are walnuts laid out to dry on the highway. Yes. Next.
G315.
Yeah, no, I think there's something slow for me. I'm not able to see the slides.
It's not moving at the same speed.
This is G315. On the right side in that haze, there is the Kunlun range, which you can't see. There's a Kunlun mountain range there. The Kunlun mountain range is parallel to the Karakoram range. It's above the Karakoram range, north of the Karakoram range. And on a clear day, if there is no mist, if there is no haze, you should be able to see that range. But unfortunately, very few people, very few travelers have actually seen the Kunlun range, thanks to this massive dust haze which hangs over that particular. In fact, it's a desert, so obviously the dust haze would be there. It's there throughout almost. Very few people have actually seen the Kunlun range. But in that dust haze is the Kunlun range. This is in a silk factory in Khotan. Khotan is famous, incidentally, not just for silk, it is famous for jade. Khotan jade is famous. These are babies of the silk workers. Next.
Mother,
Another silk worker. I called her Mother Silk. Next.
click caves,
Next.
Turpan.
I can't see. This is the Bezeklik caves in Turpan. Now, Xinjiang, apart from, the Silk Route itself, it's notorious for the fact that in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, a lot of Western archaeologists, they discovered these underground, these are all buried, by the way, under the desert sands. They discovered these archaeological sites, these caves, these Buddhist caves, which were filled with, treasures. There were, frescoes, there were manuscripts, there were scrolls, there were silk scrolls, there was all kinds of things, religious texts, and in fact, virtually the cultural heritage of China. The whole thing was carted off to the museums of the West, notoriously by archaeologists like Aurel Stein, the British archaeologist, Count Otani, the Japanese archaeologist, Paul Pelliot, the French archaeologist, and then Grunewald, the German archaeologist. There's another chap, what is his name? Von Lecoq, the German archaeologist. So all these chaps, they literally looted these caves, these treasures. All these caves now are empty. And here on this board, at the bottom right there, it says, there's one particular line which is repeated throughout. It says, stolen by Stein. That is what the Chinese have actually said. Stolen by Stein, Stein being Aurel Stein. And as far as China is concerned, Aurel Stein is their thief number one, and you can't blame them. Next.
Home of Albert von Lecoq.
Yeah, I can't see that. The home of Albert von Lecoq, yes. I think there's a
delay.
Yes, I can't see.
Now you can see the Heaven Lake.
No, I can't see. This is the home of Albert von Lecoq, the German archaeologist, who was one of the raiders, the cave raiders. This is Heaven Lake in Xinjiang, north of Urumqi. And that range there is the Bogdola range, which is in Mongolia. That range that you see is actually Mongolia, the Bogdola range. This is an alpine lake, it's a freshwater lake, glacial. Next.
Meeting with.
Next, yeah. And this is the final slide. Now, this is actually coming full circle because my entire Central Asia journey, both actual and my spiritual journey through Central Asia, my intellectual journey through Central Asia, all began with this man on the left. That is John Kay, the writer, the man who wrote When Men and Mountains Meet, the first book that I read and which set me off on my actual Central Asian, what I call my Central Asian obsession. I met him in 2019 at the Bangalore Club, and I had my copies of the books autographed by him. And I told him, I said, look, Mr. K, this is like a Chela meeting his guru after 40 odd years, and he couldn't believe it. He said, look, nobody has talked to me like this before. I said, yes, this is actually, for me, it's a consummation which I can't describe, because here I am meeting the man who set me off on my travels, literally, figuratively, and intellectually. This is a great moment for me. It was a great moment for me. I had my copies of his books autographed, and it was, as I said, a Chela meeting a guru. Well, that's the end. And I think we can get to the questions now if there are any. There was a delay in the slides, you know, I couldn't see the slides.
Yes. Yes.
But Murthy, for us, the slide transition was far faster, I think. At least I was seeing the slides much earlier than you were seeing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, KVK, just one question. How do they encourage women to study over there? They're a nomadic society.
Sorry?
I mean, do they encourage women to study and work?
Oh, yes, they
Can
do.
you?
They do, especially among the urban centers.